Good afternoon. Good morning to some of you. Good late afternoon to others. Thank you for joining today's session, part of the inService podcast series. My name is John Carroll. I'm the CEO and founder of the Service Council, and I am delighted to be joined today by my colleague, Gerardo Pelayo. Gerardo is our VP of Research and Advisory. But more importantly, sorry, Gerardo, we are excited and eager to welcome one of our newest appointees to our advisory board, Scott Allison. He's the Chief Customer Officer of DHL Supply Chain. Scott, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, John. Nice to see you again. And Gerardo, thank you.
Outstanding. So before we get into the discussion, just some housekeeping. Today's session will be available for consumption after the fact. So we welcome you to visit our website or consume it from whatever podcast channel you subscribe to. It's on all the ones that we all know and love. And you can also re-access this audio-visual version of the session, which is available on LinkedIn. We're a LinkedIn Live approved podcast. Without further ado, today's discussion is the human element of digital supply chain. A real important one, the connectivity between human, functional, and technical digital roadmaps. How do these two things converge? And we're going to dig into some trends and really it's a great discussion we have planned for today. Before we get into the discussion, Scott, we know and love you well, but for our listening audience, perhaps you could introduce yourself and then we can get into an introduction to your organization.
Sure, no problem. So yeah, Scott Allison, funny accent. So I'm originally from Scotland, just outside Glasgow. I've been with DHL for 32 years. Worked across all of the divisions, essentially, in different roles over that time period. But now find myself domiciled in Dallas, Texas. Been here for the last 11 years. Yeah, I'm trying to slow down a little bit to make you guys understand me a bit, but sometimes that works, sometimes not so good. So if I need to go over anything again, just let me know.
Will do, Scott. No worries. Thanks for joining, and maybe for our listening audience, if you could spend a little bit of time talking about DHL, well-known, recognized brand, but maybe talk a little bit about the work you've been doing in the supply chain arena and all the goodness that's happening across the world.
Yeah, so the part of the business that I work for, so I'm the Chief Customer Officer for our service logistics business. So we have a dedicated business which is there to look after anything really that is attached to a service event, whether that's a server in a data center that goes down, a mobile phone connection, a patient who might need a part, either an implantable device for a surgery, or maybe some of the imaging equipment which needs spare parts. So anything around that, we have about 1,200 forward stock locations around the world. We're in every region, 140 countries around the world. Most of our customers are sort of Fortune 500 companies, either in technology, life science, or sort of industrial applications, engineering and manufacturing type companies. And again, like I say, where there's some sort of service event that is needed, we're there. And we have about, in those 1,200 locations, we have about 35 million SKUs on hand. So it's a pretty scalable business globally.
Yeah, certainly sounds like that. Gerardo, I'm going to ask you to join the discussion, and why don't you take us through our first set of questions for Scott that we'll all iterate around together. So thank you.
Yes, happy to. And as you're talking about this massive network, it's important to question about what are the blind spots. And somewhat ironically, one of the things that comes up most often in our research is the lack of visibility. Poor visibility into the what are the available parts across the network came back as the number one challenge in our supply chain leaders survey. 49% of respondents called this out. So even though the technology keeps us accelerating, this trend is actually higher than what we saw last year, 6 percentage points higher. Are you seeing similar concerns, similar conversations as you go out into the field?
Yeah, well, actually, I was delighted with the results of the survey because it validated a lot of the things that we see going on in the marketplace, right? And what I see is that, it depends on what you term visibility, right? Visibility means a lot of things to different people, and it could be anything around, hey, I want visibility of my shipment coming to me. If I'm a field service engineer, where is that coming to me so that I can manage my jobs along the day that I have to go to? But also things like inventory visibility is key as well. And what we're seeing is that there's a few issues going on with both our client base, who don't necessarily have their systems in place to enable that level of visibility that they need. So think about companies that might acquire another company or a merger of two companies. Are they both on the same ERP? Do they have multiple ERPs? Do they have one version of it per country, one per region? So, getting visibility of what that SKU is and where it is in the world is key. From our perspective, we invested, back, I think, around about 2013 in a global standardized system, which we call Select. And it gives visibility across the network of all of the parts that might exist within that network, down to an individual SKU level. So there's many areas that cause that lack of visibility and how people would answer that. But I would say that there's many reasons why people say that they lack visibility. Some of that is down to their own organizational decisions and design. Some of that is on the supplier base, like us and our partners, to make sure that those, if it's in transit visibility of final mile, etc., that those milestones, etc., are available to the engineer when he needs them.
Yeah. And as you get into that, one thought that came to mind is that organizations sometimes think about accumulating data and accumulating visibility. And this sometimes leads to the conversation of technology debt. And if I add another tool, will I be actually adding another silo and higher resistance in my network? Can you share perhaps a couple of examples, observations that you've seen where more visibility actually causes the relevant data to become hidden, to be hard to access for the network? In other words, more starts to become less.
Yeah, look, it's we talk about relevant data, right? So, you get when you think about 1,200 FSLs, order data, logistics data, shipment data, all that stuff, it very quickly adds up to an enormous amount of data to get your hands around. And there's no doubt that there are tools out there that allow you to actually segment that data down into the things which are most important to you. But what we're seeing in the marketplace is that, we're able to get to that segmented data, but the question is which part of it is relevant for which silo within the organization. So, for instance, if I'm talking to the logistics person, are they responsible for inventory or not? Or is that the responsibility of someone in the finance department at the customer? If I'm talking about planning data or on-time delivery, is that the planning team or the customer service team that are interested in that? Or is that the logistics person who's interested in that? And what we're actually finding is that it's actually the combination of that data together that's leading us to lots of insights that are useful. And the follow on from that is the ability to then execute something against that, because we can provide all sorts of nice insights, but in the last few years we've given lots of insights to customers and they say, well, Scott, that's great, but I can't do anything with it because I don't have the change management processes in place to be able to execute what you're telling me. And so I think generally, I think there's a lot of work to be done to try and, part of this is about the human element in technology. I think some of that goes back to organizational design and those kind of things in terms of how do you take advantage of the insights and the data that's available to you today.
Yeah, Gerardo, I was just going to add a few points behind the concept of visibility. And we all agree that visibility is not enough. It's not enough, right? And there are different elements of visibility. You're talking about functional and logistics and execution. One of the things that spoke to me as we looked at the 2023 data versus the 2024 data from the State of the Market Supply Chain Survey was the year-over-year increase and decrease between the trends, right? So the poor integration of service parts within the overall service business, it showed progress. It dropped 10 points year over year. So there's greater integration within the business. What showed advancement was no metrics to measure the health of the service parts. So in terms of visibility, there's an element here of work to be done with respect to metrics for success and how available those metrics are. And I think we're going to get into that in a little bit, but I just wanted to talk about the year-over-year analysis as we see it. Service parts management has traditionally and historically been a very mature business with respect to leading versus lagging indicators. And I know we're going to dive into that in a few moments, but that was just some of the interesting observations as I look year over year at some of the data points.
And John, one of the things which, I took that statistic on the 35 million SKUs when I looked at one of our dashboards this morning. That was like hot off the press this morning with 35 million SKUs on hand as of this morning. 42% of that has not moved in a year, right? So we're answering the question for the customers to say, yes, give me visibility of what you have on hand. But if 42% of that is not moved in more than a year, then how do we segment that inventory to actually make it more relevant, right? Is that 42% based on just in case? I don't think so, right? There's many reasons why that might be the case, but what we've been able to do is to start working with companies to try and segment that data into meaningful buckets that they can actually do something with, right? So if you've got a SKU in one location, you might not have a demand there. Well, why don't you move it to another location, right? And if you don't have the visibility of that, you can't do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And as we start getting into the figures, for example, 42% not moving in a year will sound terrible for somebody in high tech. Will sound more common for somebody perhaps in oil and gas and heavy industrial assets. So understanding what is the value that I'm actually expecting to get when it comes to these metrics starts to become very important, as we were talking about segmentation. And one of the red flags that we saw in the service leaders agenda is an extreme focus on lagging indicators. So what happened before rather than what's happening after. I want to get into both, but let's start with the lagging piece. As you looked at it today, you have this many SKUs, they haven't moved. Can you talk about some of the better practices that some organizations are doing that you're facilitating to move from reporting this type of metrics towards diagnosing? Is it good? Is it bad? And why is it happening?
Yeah, maybe I can take it one step further, which is how do you operationalize change out of that as well? So there's one really good example that we have. It's a semiconductor company that we work with, and a lot of the semiconductor equipment manufacturers are based in Silicon Valley on the West Coast. I think we all know how expensive real estate is on the West Coast. And this, when we looked across the industry, actually, although this is a story of one semiconductor company, actually we do business with a number of them and they all have the same challenge. And it's similar to what you said, Gerardo, on the industrial side, is that a lot of the equipment that they have to service might go back into the 80s, right? So some of the old 6-inch wafer fabs, some of that equipment is still hanging around, believe it or not, in some older technology use cases. And so they have to support those parts all the way through that life cycle. So that's going on, maybe 40, 50 years ago that they have to support that part. Nevertheless, do you have to hold 1,000 of those parts in downtown sort of, I don't know, Santa Clara or San Jose, right? Which is one of the most expensive real estate markets in the world, right? Or as the customer entitlement stretches, could we move some of that inventory to a more low cost location that gives, both space for the existing operation for the fast moving parts to make sure that they get out on time and they have a high level of service for the for the fast movers, as well as warehousing and storing those older parts at a lower cost, but still having access to them in a reasonable SLA to be able to do that. So that's a great example of where we've been able to do that, is doing an analysis of the inventory. We actually supplemented that with a value stream mapping exercise to look at, hey, if we were to move this out of the current operation, could we even improve the performance of the existing operation, the on-time delivery, the cost? And I know you guys work in the semicon industry as well. With the predicted growth that's going to come there in the next 7 years, we also had to make some room for growth, right? So we were able to analyze the data, come up with some scenarios where the customer went internally to their stakeholders and said, hey, we have some opportunities here to reduce cost and improve service. Well, lo and behold, not everyone in the customer organization had the same view in terms of what we should do with that inventory, and so there was probably a 6 months back and forth between the planning organization, the engineering organization, and the logistics organization at the customer to say, okay, what's the right thing to do with this inventory, which is clearly, taking up room and causing problems in our existing operations. But eventually we were able to get over that hump. And so, I think there are ways through that, but it's these, again, I go back to these organizational silos, which I think are causing some of the bumps in the road from a supply chain point of view in services.
Hey, Scott, I have a couple points on top of that. So one of which is on the sourcing element that you bring up in terms of the decision to de-risk the supply chain, which is a trend that we see continuing as we look at the year-over-year data. Where we're seeing an increase more prominently, 10% increase year over year from 2023 to 2024 around onshoring.
Yeah.
Nearshoring witnessed an 8-point increase. Insourcing, a 7-point increase. So de-risking the supply chain continues to be a trend, and whether that's tied to geopolitical climate, a little bit of the scar tissue from pandemic, or just going to be the common moving forward, I continue to see this element of de-risking the supply chain that's coming about. The other thing you talk about and use the word stakeholder. I think there's a dynamic playing out in terms of who owns the service parts business, and how do you treat the service parts business? Is it a profit and loss? We saw a plus 7-point increase year over year in those organizations that either weren't sure, didn't know, or definitely weren't running their parts business as a profit and loss.
Yeah.
And where we saw a real discrepancy was around which business function owns service parts, right? So service ownership fell by 12 points year over year.
Yeah.
And when you take that as a totality, that's a 1/3 drop from the previous year in terms of those that responded that service owned parts. And we're seeing more prominently supply chain jumped up 6 points. We're seeing, multiple management of multiple businesses managing it. So a decentralized strategy. So are you seeing a dynamic shift in terms of ownership?
Well, if you look at what happened after the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
When everyone, the best example I can give you is the hybrid work environment,
Yeah.
right? So if you put yourself in the shoes of a laptop manufacturer or a
Yeah.
PC manufacturer. What's happening there is that the whole hybrid work environment has moved towards what probably will become some sort of device as a service market, right?
Mm-hmm.
So instead of those manufacturing selling a device to you, and you own the asset for 4 years and then you buy a new one, it looks like that is then going to turn into a lease model, at least for a relatively large percentage of what the market in the enterprise space is going to look like. And so what you saw was that what used to be a finished goods manufacturing supply chain, where you would ship, pallet loads of devices to retail, distribution, those types of channels, and large enterprise companies, you saw, hey, I need to ship an individual unit already flashed to Scott Allison sitting in Allen, Texas. So if you compare that to the needs of the typical service supply chain, that's much more used to shipping around individual units that have to go very quickly, plus bringing stuff back. If you think about engineering returns, that's normal business for those of us working in the service supply chain. But those of us who are working in the manufacturing supply chain or the finished goods supply chain are not that used to getting that volume of returns coming back on a regular basis. So what I've seen is that there's a convergence actually going on from a logistics point of view between finished goods supply chains and services supply chains. It used to be, in most of our clients at least, those were two very different organizations, and we're seeing a convergence because of that lower order quantity and fast-moving need in terms of the logistics space. So the consequence of that, though, is that for most companies, the manufacturing supply chain is a cost center, right? And they're looking to reduce that cost as much as they can, to make as much money on the product as they can. That's very different than the service space, which typically is a profit center. And so if you look at it in the wrong way, you can make the wrong decisions in terms of how you set your supply chain up.
Interesting viewpoints.
Yeah.
Gerardo, back to you.
Yeah, and following up on that, actually, so the flip side of that trend that we're seeing in the reorganization of the chain is a higher risk that is being perceived on how much organizations rely on their partners. This jumped from 21 to 37% as a source of concern year over year. And as you scratch the surface on the use of technology earlier in the conversation, so both from a technology and a change management process sharing perspective, do you have any success stories of how this can help mitigate that risk of partner dependencies and improve coordination?
Yeah, maybe a couple of examples. We took over a client business last year, and they were actually, there was 119 forward stock locations in the US, which we deployed in a sort of 3-month period, and so we took over the business. And if you think about the forward stock locations that we run, they're typically servicing same-day requirements for service. So, a break fix event goes down, an engineer goes out, we get the part to the engineer, and within, if that's a data center or a cellular network, those things they need to have a high availability uptime. So typically those are same-day events, and normally that field service network that we have is set up in large metro centers that can respond to those types of incidents. But what we noticed 3 months after we went live with that business was that 94% of the orders that we were picking from the locations were going out next business day to the engineers. So we started asking, well, why is that, right? Because typically we're only getting involved in critical events. And what we found out once we dug down a couple of layers through logistics into the planning community was that the main distribution centres, which we didn't operate, what actually had a cut-off reduction by 2 hours in the afternoon, which meant that the planners at that client said, well, I can't get a next morning delivery into those customers anymore. I'm going to ship those SKUs out into the network and then pick the orders from the network on the next business day to the end customer. So they were I call it unintentional consequences, if you like. They were doing the best thing for the customer, but because of the lack of connection between the different people in their own organization, they didn't understand that that actually ended up with an additional cost. When we annualized that cost, it was about an additional $1.6 million, just to provide the customer with the same service experience that they had in the past, rather than going back and looking at the root cause of what was causing the 2 hour delay on the cutoff time at the tier one replenishment center. And so, getting back to your question, Gerardo, I think, the problem that I see is that as long as organizations continue this siloed mentality, then they're going to have to outsource to companies like DHL or others, because they only know what they know. What they don't know is what's on the outside looking in, right? And so we were the ones that were able to point that out to them, to say, hey, there's something fishy going on in how you're fulfilling these customer orders. Can we take a look at that, right? And quite honestly, if we didn't have the data and behind it and the single system behind it, nobody would have known, and that would have just that would have been the go forward model for forevermore. So I think there's clearly pros and cons to insourcing versus outsourcing, but I think the benefit that we see, because obviously we're an outsourcing company, is that we see more than what you can only see yourself, right? So if I look at enterprise computing, we work with probably 9 of the top 10 companies. So we can benchmark between those companies in terms of who's got best practices, versus you only seeing what only you know, right?
Yeah, and so I really like how you connected the dots there in that story, from especially important when it comes to scale. As as we think about behavioral elements that are driving the problems, but one would expect well, you cannot really resolve those unless you're engaging directly with the person and one at a time, and that's hard to scale. What you demonstrate in this example is actually by accumulating the data, by having expectations on what, given the processes, given the demand flow, you were likely to see, and there's this disconnect against what you're actually seeing, that leads to the discovery, to the asking questions, and it happens in a much more targeted method. So it's as sometimes the technology data conversations can become too elevated. This is a good way of demonstrating it actually works when done properly.
Yeah.
And so we've talked perhaps a little more about what happened in the past and how do we use that to change the future. I also want to talk about leading indicators. And one interesting thing, one interesting result we saw from a separate research is that organizations that were doing successful AI initiatives, in particular with high ROI, were not only getting the benefits out of that, but they were also 10 times more likely to change the way in which they were measuring the business, to change the KPIs. And the rationale behind this was to start to identify other drivers, other risk areas. When it comes to spare parts visibility and the predicted performance of where the risks might be, have you seen early examples of organizations thinking differently about the future?
Yeah, I think it goes back to something that John mentioned earlier in terms of making the supply chain more resilient. I think that's probably the best example so far. And when you combine that resiliency factor with supply chain visibility, so where are my parts and where are my parts not, right? You can very quickly get to some quite clever methods of making sure that you've got the right parts in the right place when your customers are going to need them. So we had a great example in Indonesia. Actually, it was just after the pandemic. Enterprise computing company, and we operated 6 locations. And Indonesia is very lots of islands in Indonesia, right? The main one, which is where Jakarta is, and that's where the main distribution center actually was. But so what we found was that most of the SKUs that we were holding were located at the main distribution center, but the other 5 locations, which were on all these different islands, didn't have the right parts. And by deploying our inventory visibility solution, customers were able to then say, well, hang on a minute, let's think about this from a single source of supply point of view, right? If any of those customers in any of those 6 islands had a need for that part during the pandemic, we would have had a problem because we couldn't move it between those islands, right? So what we did was we forward positioned a lot of those, and it doesn't have to be a lot, right? It can be 2 or 3 parts, just as emergency supply that can sit there just in case they're needed. So by employing inventory visibility and trying to visualize that in terms of where is my install base and where are my parts and how do I make sure that I've got the right parts in the right place. We've seen a lot of that go on in the last 2 or 3 years, where they're using the data that we're now providing to say, hang on a minute, we've got 1,000 of them in Germany, but actually I need 20 of them in Brazil, right? And so they're moving that inventory around so that they're not relying on those single sources of supply. So yeah, it's just making the network much more resilient.
Very, very interesting viewpoints there, Scott. And I think on the topic of KPIs and metrics, this shift in mentality towards a leading metric orientation, not just lagging in terms of the causal factors, not necessarily just the outcomes that are achieved, right? So you've got, outcome-oriented metrics are things like profitability or fill rates. Those are, achievement-oriented. The ones that are causal in nature are things like on-time delivery, planning, forecasting, and pricing, triage and dispatch efficiency. And in the area of triage and dispatch efficiency, we're actually seeing an increasing alarming trend, if that choice of words pulls together correctly, with respect to first-time fix rates being achieved, right? Which is an outcome-based metric in the field service-centric set of business climates, where last year we asked what percentage of unsuccessful field visits were due to the unavailability of the appropriate part. And 1 in 5 last year indicated greater than 30%. Well, this year it was 1/3. So it's actually going in the wrong direction. So the importance of, right technician, right skill set, right location, but right part, that last leg of the journey is still a critical area of opportunity as we see it.
Well, right part, and is it in the right place, right? That's one of the things which we see a lot, and actually there's we've found one of the root causes for that. So lots of planning systems are actually set up based on you know, congregating inventory, right? Because obviously the more that you split your inventory, the more cost there is for the inventory. So it tends to, the planning systems tend to say, I want to concentrate my inventory into less locations. What we found was actually we were doing long drives, you know, maybe 600 kilometers or 600 miles, and driving past a location which was only 30 miles from the customer to get to the customer. And we said, well, why is that inventory not at that location? And it was actually the planning algorithm that was driving that, saying, hey, I mean, we might have replenished that part to that location, and then the planning algorithm would say, hey, bring that back because we want to consolidate the inventory, right? And so it was the way that we solved it with that customer was to, hey, we need to take logistics decisions into account when we're building our planning algorithms. And again, who do you think builds the planning algorithms? It's the planning team, right? The logistics folks don't typically get you know, some sort of input there that says, hey, we should look at that a bit differently. And I think there's lots of different reasons why a part might not be available. You know, was it actually, you know, do they have any inventory of it at all? Do they have inventory but they don't actually know where it is, right? That's one of the big, probably large causes I would suggest.
Yeah, and one comment on that example is we see people struggling with building a business case to incorporate the elements that they need to improve the operation all the time. And one thing that you mentioned caught especially caught my attention, which was everybody has their own metrics,
Yeah.
right? And when we think like that, not only the operation suffers, but also when we try to improve the operation, then it's very hard to justify because everybody's pulling in a different direction, and it's extremely complicated to build a common reality and how the improvements will translate across the organization rather than uh, do the short blanket syndrome of you pull in one place and you get exposed in the other.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting. I did want to add also as we talk about the right part, the right place, and all of that can be very effective. But in our voice of the field service engineer, which is currently in market this year, it's the biggest capability that the field is still asking for, even ahead of troubleshooting support and AR, VR capabilities, which are getting increasing attention. But the number one remains visibility of spare parts inventory in the network. And that leads me to question, are there situations where everything is where it should be and it's available? It's just that the people who need to use it, the field service engineers, are not aware of it. And first off, have you come across this, or is this just a theoretical example?
No, well, that's no, that's an actual example. You know, one of the things that we come across quite often is that the people who are responsible for the inventory, they're a bit nervous about how far we're allowed to go as DHL in providing tools to the field, because they're worried about who's going to get the part, right? So, you know, if there's one part available and you have a strategic customer or a less strategic customer, and the less strategic customer gets that part based on, you know, the field service engineer being the first guy to place the order. They're very nervous about that, is our experience. So most companies, I would say, and most clients that we deal with, they tend to put a bit of a barrier between the field and us in terms of you know, giving them full access to you know, where is the part, what's the you know, they don't necessarily want the field service engineer to see what inventory is available where, so that they, you know, and I think some of that is down to behaviors in terms of how they manage those behaviors of the guys in the field. I have to say, we also have examples where we have a customer, a medical equipment customer in the US, where we have 2,000 engineers who have a mobile app that we provide that gives them, real-time GPS visibility of parts on their way to them. And we're saying, hey, we can see the benefit of that, because if that engineer is normally looking to optimize his day based on when part availability is there, right? So the more we can give them that, I think the better. But the challenge is going to be, especially giving them access to what inventory is available where. I think there is something there which needs to be controlled a bit. So yeah, that's an absolute thing that we see going on in the marketplace.
Yeah, no, great insights on that again.
Yeah.
So as we're getting close to the latter part of the podcast, I wanted to ask a more open-ended question. We've led the conversation in different ways. Are there other gotcha moments, any lessons learned, especially from this organizational readiness, that you'd like to share with the audience?
I think one of the things that I would suggest that companies look at is more internally, in terms of how they are, what's their organizational design and how are they measured on all of the things related to spare parts, right? Because honestly, I always say, when you look at visibility, all of the TMS tools are out there. The technology exists. Lots of customers come to me and say, how can I get the Amazon experience, right? The Amazon experience exists, right? What doesn't exist is our clients' ability to take advantage of some of that technology, right? And so there's definitely ways that companies could be organized better to take advantage of that. So think about how is your ERP organized? Is it a single instance globally, or do you have many instances based on every country? How are you structured? Is every country king? Is there a managing director of every country? Or is there global decision making on the direction that you want to go in? And how does that influence your master data and the systems that you have? Because your master data for us is key in order to then come back and offer the tools that we have available or that are available in the marketplace to take advantage of that. So I think there's many things that there's huge opportunity out there. If I was in charge of a spare parts organization just now, the first thing I would do is go through some sort of education process between logistics and planning, and try and streamline some of those processes, because I just think there's so much opportunity there that exists.
Hey, Scott, I have a question for you. It's kind of the obligatory question that we build into most of our podcasts, and that is your viewpoint on the impact of Gen AI within the supply chain.
Yeah.
Obviously, the supply chain's gone through an evolution over the last several decades. I think it was I2 that coined the term parts planning way back when, and then ERP providers came quickly behind and taking the supply chain planning from hours to minutes, and now Gen AI intends to take the supply chain solves from minutes to real time, and perhaps even avoidance as we look at it, automation moving forward. How are you seeing this within the clients and the customers that you're impacting worldwide in terms of Gen AI and its potential?
It's in its infancy, right?
Sure.
So there's lots of companies who are out, looking for pilots and proof points and use cases for how to use it. Actually, I think there's also a convergence of technology which is going to help with this as well. I was at one of the forums that you guys host, and one of our big supply bases is obviously forklift trucks, right? And I think you probably know that we're all in on automation now. So, you know, we've got autonomous reach trucks out there these days. And I was talking to one of those companies, and I said, hey, you know, can I talk to you about your forward stocking locations and how you get your spare parts to the market? And he said, no, we don't have forward stock locations because all of our new technology has predictive maintenance devices inside the device, right? So that, you know, that obviously, I was starting thinking about that, saying, wow, what does that mean for our forward stock locations in future if every device is going to have some sort of predictive maintenance thing? Because he was saying that, you know, 6 weeks ahead of a device failing, they get some sort of indication that something's going to go wrong, and then they ship the part by ground, actually, from the central DC out to the customer site, and then the engineer break fix event is a scheduled event, you know, maybe a month in advance, right? And imagine that, right? Some of our clients are like, you know, they're out during the night tomorrow because something's going wrong. So I think that type of technology combined with AI will really change the market in terms of, you know, where inventory, well, what are the algorithms that are going to be used to determine where inventory is going to be held and then supplied from in future. We typically run a 3-tier network today, a main distribution center, then either in-country distribution centers or regional distribution centers in larger markets like the US. So you would have the main DC in the center of the country, one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast, and then the FSL network is the tier 3s, which are very close to the the point of demand. But I can see that changing in future, right? In terms of, you know, if we can truly become more predictive in terms of where devices are going to fail, you know, the more notice we have there, the more we can plan for that, and then it becomes a regular service event rather than an emergency event. So it's going to come. Question is when, and what other jobs can we apply for to try and find something else in terms of adding value.
Yeah, again, very interesting, and it triggered another thought. So last week we had a service journey day at Coca-Cola. This are events we do every other month. We pull together 30, 40 executives around problem solving, and we were talking about managing a distributed network. So very aligned with the topic that we have today, and the things that resonated and I wanted to share here is one that when we try to overdo governance, when we want to try to mitigate the risks of having that distributed network, we cannot forget about the impact that could have on empowerment and innovation. And in particular, one of the data points we're seeing from the field service engineers as well is 6 out of 10 say that the feedback that they are providing to improve the operation, and we heard 40% complain about parts, that feedback is not getting incorporated. And 7 out of 10 say that they are not rewarded and that their feedback is not directly addressed with them. So this could be true for field service engineers, but also for the other parts of the chain, and being cognizant of where the new opportunities could come from, as you were thinking about the new way to imagine FSLs and their roles as an example. I think it's going to be very important to keep those communication channels very open to drive clarity of communication across the organization to take advantage of the many examples that you've given today.
Yeah, let me give you the opposite view as well, right? With a small anecdote, Gerardo. I had a client recently who went on a ride along with a field service engineer. So this was the logistics guy going out with the field service guy, and they said, right, I want to come with you on your day and go around and sort of a little bit like undercover CEO kind of thing, right? You've seen the sketch. So, and the first place they went to was a storage location, and the logistics guy said, "Hey, what is this? This is clearly isn't a customer location." And he said, "Yeah, no, this is where I have all my stuff." I said, "What do you mean all your stuff?" So he went into the storage location, and there was about $500,000 worth of inventory in that location,
Wow.
which was completely uncontrolled, right, and off the books, right, and nobody knew it was there. And then the guy said, "By the way, there's about 300 of these across the US." So so imagine the opportunity that exists, right? So I take your point that, I mean, at the end of the day, my job at DHL as well is to make the field service engineer's job easy. And if that happens, then my job gets easier because the logistics guys are satisfied, right? But there's two sides to every coin, right? And that this thing had been going on for I don't know how long, years, tens of years, right? And nobody knew about it. And so, there's a lot. That's my point, right? I think the more that we do that type of stuff, it sounds
Mhm.
very basic, but there are so much opportunities out there if we all truly understand what's going on, not just in our own job, but what's when we hand it off to the next guy. What do they do with that, right? So I think there's so much opportunity there.
Yeah, that's a great story, and it takes us full circle with how data and technology can help us spot these opportunities as well that have a lot to do with the behavioral elements
That's right.
in the
Absolutely.
organization. So, great way to close the loop, Scott. Um, so before we let you go, as John said at the start of the session, we're very happy and humbled to have you serve in the advisory board. I wanted to ask you what is your impression so far? What are some of the things that you've liked that you perhaps got them value out of the community?
Yeah, look, well, I'm humbled to be asked to come onto the board. It's we were looking around different forums over the last 2 or 3 years, and you play in these forums and you figure out is it for you or not, and actually the service forum was the one that we were looking for in terms of content, seniority, the ability to learn. That's what I'm most looking forward to, and I've actually experienced. I mean, we went to the service forum in September last year in Chicago. We joined it earlier this year, so it's only been maybe 3 or 4 months already, and we've got a lot out of it. I mean, the service parts. I mentioned that at the start of this call. I mean, the service parts survey that you did was basically a validation of what we've been trying to tell customers for the last 5 or 6 years that I've been here in service logistics at DHL. And, it's great to have that external source that comes from the market instead of having the great yellow and red, sticker on it saying oh, it's DHL that's telling you that. When you can say that that has come from the market, it changes the dynamic of the conversations with your clients. So thank you for you guys for doing that. And hopefully, I'm looking. I love these types of settings where we can share a little bit of our best practices and experience. And I've been on a couple of the podcasts already, and I've learned some things along the way as well. So looking forward to it, and long may it continue.
Yeah,
Scott, we're equally humbled. Thank you for joining. Your contributions have been many in that short period of time that you've been a board member. And quick shameless plug for our listening audience. Scott was mentioning our Smarter Services Executive Symposium. Save the date, mark your calendars. September 9th through 11th, we will once again be in Chicago. DHL will be there. Many of their customers will be there. And it's setting the stage to be one of our best events yet. The agenda is coming together fantastically. So we'll be previewing the content over the coming summer period here. And but please save the date. We'd love to see you in Chicago. Gerardo, I'm going to close out with a question for Scott, and this is unrelated to anything we've talked about, Scott, and that is, tell us a little bit about you personally, something, a passion, something outside of work.
I'm a passionate. Well, I'm actually a registered soccer coach, which goes back to Europe. So I'm a UEFA and USSF registered coach. for youth soccer. When I got my global job, I had to give that up, and I look forward to someday getting back to that. My son was a pretty accomplished soccer player here in the US, and won the US national championship. And actually, I just spent 2 weeks with him at the European Championships, following Scotland, which didn't end up so well for us Scottish people, but we had a hell of a party over there, so it was great fun. So yeah, so that's a bit about me. And you know, if I look forward, maybe 10 years, maybe hopefully a bit less, I can hopefully get back to that coaching part again, because you know, I just love that. There's nothing like working with young people, and then when it comes together and they start doing what you are sort of trying to demonstrate to them is a great thing to happen.
Outstanding. Well, listen, he is Scott Allison. He's the Chief Customer Officer of DHL Supply Chain. He is a board member of the Service Council, which we are incredibly grateful for, has made many contributions in that capacity. If you're looking to revisit today's podcast, it'll be available on our website, on whatever podcast channel you subscribe to, as well as LinkedIn. Gerardo, any closing thoughts for you before we close out today's session?
Scott, you've been a great guest. Thank you for your time, and kudos to the audience. A Scottish accent, a Mexican accent, and a Boston accent, all wrapped into one. I
hope everyone could understand what was going on.
It was very clear. Thank you, Scott.
Outstanding. Have a great rest of the summer, and we'll see you on the next segment. Thank you for joining us.
Very good.